I did a video on lime and I upset an awful lot of lime fundamentalists. Those people that love lime and believe that they know everything about lime, and they really went for me in the comments.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for taking the time to join me today. So today we're back with Skill Builder, where he's talking about our favourite material in the whole world, lime mortar again. Now, this video is entitled, I Was Wrong About Lime. And after his previous video on the subject and my subsequent reaction, I was pleasantly surprised to see this video, given the title. Now, this video features an absolute host of names from within the conservation field, discussing various aspects of lime mortar production, application. And so with these voices and the humble title, all was seemingly quite promising. Now, Roger, at the start of this video, has made it clear that he received a lot of negative comments and some nasty ones. So I just want to make it clear that that's not being condoned here at all. But I do want to go through this properly because, you know, an admission of being wrong is brilliant. But what exactly is it that you're saying you're wrong about is the question that I had. And with this list of experts, what exactly has been learned? There were a lot of claims in the last video regarding how lime mortar, quote unquote, fell out of favour, with NHL now being imported from outside the EU, building with hydrated lime and cement, and then pointing the same wall facing that same system with an actual lime mortar. How NHL is too strong, how a hydraulic 3.5 mortar is equivalent to using a 611 hydrated lime and cement mix. His explanation of what he sort of grouped as the three lime types, hydraulic, hydrated and hot lime. Sort of a broad explanation of autogenous healing. You know, there was a claim that the exact same autogenous healing occurs in a hydrated lime and cement mortar. So, of course, I was intrigued and slightly optimistic. If you haven't yet seen the first video I covered, then please be sure to go ahead and give that a watch first if this sort of thing interests you.
So what I want to do here, I'm going to change my tack slightly and I'm going to let the experts talk. But let's have a listen to what Nigel has to say, shall we?
And they were adamant that the optimal lime with which to build a building to keep it dry and thermally efficient and all of these things was to use pure lime.
So, Copsy begins by referencing early USBS standards, United States Bureau of Standards, and the testing that they carried out. And importantly, he sets the context. So it's important for me to note here that this context is provided in the full version of the Heritage Building podcast with Vincent Reed. I encourage you to go and watch that. Not in the redacted clip that is shown on the Skill Builder channel. So anyways, the context is that at the turn of the 20th century, much of the United States was still building in solid wall construction, whereas here in the UK, we'd already moved more broadly into cavity wall construction. So in America, moisture and damp issues were being encountered much more directly, and that's what led to a lot of this early testing. So that context there, for me, matters. From there, Copsy then explains that there was a perceived need for faster early hardening in mortars to allow for quicker construction. And like I'd previously mentioned, there's, you know, cost association involved in that and other factors. But you begin to see the rise of cement lime mixes. So the key point for me that he makes is not just about speed, it's about how these mortars then behave. So the cementitious mortars, they set quickly, they retain less water, and crucially, they often fail to form a complete continuous bond with softer masonry. And that leads to the important part, that you get micro discontinuities at the interface, which then act as capillary pathways for water ingress. And that's the mechanism that's being described. Now, just to be clear, because this is where confusion creeps in, capillary action itself is not the problem. In a lime mortar, capillary is exactly what allows it to work properly. It absorbs and then redistributes and releases moisture. What Copsy is describing is different. This is capillary movement along a failed bond, not through a functioning material.
US Bureau standards demonstrated in lots of ways the things that I'm talking to you about. The cement mortars, because they dry too fast and they need water to set properly because they're hydraulic materials, whereas air limes need to get rid of their water to set properly. Hydraulic materials, cement, natural hydraulic lime, natural cement, they need to stay wet as long as possible to set properly. The equation is opposite in effect. So they were showing that because cement mortars don't hold their water very efficiently, they want to dry very fast, the bond between the brick and the mortar was not good. There were capillary pathways between, left because it hadn't made a full extent of bond. And that was why the buildings were leaking like sieves. Water was just coming through.
So now Roger responds to that by saying,
That won't matter if the wall is a cavity wall, because that's the way they're designed now, that we accept the fact that there will be water that will be creeping through along the mortar lines.
yeah, so it won't matter if it's a cavity wall. We accept the fact that there will be water creeping through and trickling down the inside, essentially. And for me, this just misses the point. See, I think Copsy is explaining why water is getting into the wall in the first place. Roger then responds by addressing what happens after it's already there. Those aren't the same thing. The idea that this won't matter in a cavity wall only works under extremely unrealistic, strict, perfect conditions where you have a completely clean cavity, no bridging, completely correct detailing. But even before you get to any of that, there's the more fundamental issue that's being ignored of material compatibility. So Copsy makes a very clear point later on. And he says that in much of the UK's housing stock, particularly in social housing, weaker cement lime mixes like a 129 or a 1312 were common or preferably used. And in those cases, they can still perform reasonably well, even sacrificially. But again, those buildings, mid 20th century-ish, were harder machine-made bricks, more consistent, controlled materials. That isn't the same as when you're dealing with earlier masonry, softer, more porous bricks, or anything approaching historic fabric. So even in a perfectly constructed cavity wall with no debris, no bridging, no insulation, nothing altered, if you take a soft brick and pair it with a hard, dense mortar, it's still fundamentally incompatible and it still matters. So there isn't just this issue of water getting into the wall, it's how the materials share moisture, how they bond, and where stress and decay are directed over time. And you can't correct that mismatch with a cavity wall system. You can't design around it. You can't reduce it to it won't matter. A cavity wall system is a system for managing a certain level of ingress. It's not a justification for incompatible materials being used in the first place.
So it's not a problem as such. It is a problem when you're talking about a solid brick wall, 9-inch wall or something like that. I fully concede that that's a different issue. But of course it's got a lot further to go through that wall before it gets to the inside. So
then there's this idea that obviously the moisture has a lot further to go, right? But that is true, but only to an extent. And again, it's just viewing damp and moisture movement and the way that a building as a system functions in such a uniform, closed off way. Like, moisture movement isn't governed solely by distance. So even singling that out as a thing just simplifies it to a point that it becomes redundant. And so yeah, in no way is moisture movement solely governed by distance. It's governed by capillary pathways, permeability, evaporation, cycles of these things. And so a thicker wall doesn't automatically perform better in that context. Only a compatible system does.
They illustrated the more lime, the better. And they saw those cement lime mortars as a compromise mortar, not as the best, but as a compromise.
A compromise being that you've got to get the building built faster and you haven't got ages and ages to let it all set, so, modern construction methods, as I say, lime would be an impractical solution on its own.
Cement lime mortars became the most common mortar of construction. We have most of our council housing in the UK, our social housing, was built with cement lime mortars, but not with 116, which was the stronger one and had the lowest level of free lime, air lime, but with typically 129, and so the mid-range, and if possible with 1312. And these buildings, we have to say, I'd invite anyone here, next time they're passing through any town in Britain, look at those brick council houses built in the mid-20th century. They're typically dry. The mortars are in very good good condition. And where you've had a leaking gutter or something for years and years, those mortars, or the 129, will typically behave sacrificially. They'll fail in preference to the bricks, which is what lime mortars do. In the lime revival, and I'm a creature of it, got most things wrong. I'm saying that as someone who was very much a creature of that lime revival.
So that's Nigel Copsy saying that a lot of mistakes were made, a lot of misconceptions, a lot of wrong assumptions about lime and how it worked. But he's now moved over to hot lime mixing, which is okay, but it's got its problems.
So Copsy actually makes a really brilliant balanced point here. He says that much of the UK's housing stock, particularly social housing, used weaker cement lime mixes, a 1-2-9 or a 1-3-12 preferably, optimally, the more lime the better. And that in many cases they still perform well and can even act sacrificially. So this isn't being framed as an anti-cement argument. It's about appropriate strength and compatibility. But it seems like Roger's takeaway at the end of this is, well, there was a lot of mistakes and he's now moved over to hot lime mixing, which doesn't really engage with what's being said. It isn't about switching sides. It's about understanding that not all mortars behave the same and that performance depends on bond compatibility and how moisture is managed, not simply whether cement is present or not. And so, Copsy says there specifically not a 6-1-1 mix because, like I said in the previous video, cement, when added to a 6-1-1, becomes the dominant binder. So that completely goes against everything that Roger previously stated. But there's no real acknowledgement of that here. And then also earlier, there's the framing of this compromise that Copsy speaks of about building faster. But again, the way that Roger frames it, it's an oversimplification again, because lime mortars can achieve early stability sufficient for construction. And Copsy alludes to this himself in this very clip, talking about his own personal experience. And so the distinction isn't just speed, it's predictable early strength versus long-term compatibility. And finally, I think it's important to just reiterate that there's a removal of the initial context that Copsy gave about solid wall construction in the US versus cavity wall construction in the UK. And when you remove that context, the argument gets reframed and then dismissed using cavity wall logic, and that's not really engaging. That's, for me, it's selective framing. So in summary, Copsy is describing a material issue with bond compatibility and moisture pathways, and Roger responds with a system assumption that the wall will just deal with water anyway. And for me, those aren't interchangeable frameworks. Even if the system is compromised, which it often is, then increased water ingress isn't harmless. It's not just, oh, it's fine because it's a cavity. It's really not that simple. This ingress will build up over time and cause problems. So if the brick is porous and the mortar doesn't have active capillary pathways, then there's issues. So it's not about whether a wall can tolerate water, it's about whether materials are controlling it properly in the first place. So in this section, Copsy clarifies issues with hydraulic mixes, how pure lime mixes were understood historically to be the best in terms of thermal and moisture management properties, and how mixes at a 6-1-1 are too strong, and how 9-2-1 and 12-3-1 mixes fare in comparison, including how they behave over time. But yeah, moving on.
So here we've got Joe Troback.
Something that happens a lot in the UK, which ruins buildings, and obviously I'm really passionate about that. Somebody has repointed a historic building that would have originally been, as you can see, this more creamy colour, built with lime mortar, and they've repointed it here, as you can see, with cement mortar. This ruins buildings because you can see this is harder than the brick, so it means the only place that the water will come out naturally is through the weakest point, which is the brick.
So then we brought this clip of Joe Troback. Now, much of this section I find doesn't really go anywhere, but for continuity, there are just a few key points that are worth addressing. So we see Joe stood in front of a historic brick wall, the soft older brick, and she's explaining that it's been repointed in cement mortar. She says that this ruins buildings because the mortar is harder than the brick, so moisture is being forced out through the face of the brick. Roger then responds by saying,
Now, that's interesting because this is something that people say over and over again, that if you repoint with sand and cement, you're going to lock the moisture in. It can't then escape through the lime and it's going to come out through the face of the brick. All very, very true.
Which is thus far brilliant. The mechanism is acknowledged. But then he immediately starts trying to qualify it, and this is where the analysis begins to break down again.
If you look at this, it's a very thin bit of repointing that they've done over the top of that lime mortar.
So, looking at the wall here, he says it's a very thin bit of pointing over the top of that lime mortar, but that's not something that you can determine from what we're looking at here. What we're seeing is a section of exposed lime with cement either side, and what's then being assumed from that is that the cement has popped off and that the remaining pointing must all be shallow in uniformity with what you can see the depth is exposed there, but that's pure speculation. Equally, and just as logically, that lime that is exposed could have always been visible, i.e. it hasn't been pointed over the top of at all, and the cement that we can see elsewhere on the wall could be deeply embedded. So the only way to know that is to remove the cement and to inspect it properly. Diagnosing depth from a surface view like that isn't really analysis, it's speculation and assumption. So
obviously decayed bricks, and you can see that what's happened is that the cement and mortar has popped off in those areas. So why would it have popped off in those areas? Well, it wasn't put into any great depth anyway. But if we look by Joe's face, you'll see some other bricks which are clearly different, which haven't deteriorated. What we don't know about this wall is how far gone those bricks were with the lime mortar before it was repointed with sand and cement. It's obviously a question of what your bricks are like. So you can't simply say that every time you use sand and cement to repoint a wall that was built with lime that you're going to be doing any great damage to it.
But again, even if we accept that in those areas the cement is shallow, it doesn't tell you how deep it is elsewhere, how long it's been there, what the mix is, or whether the bricks you're looking at are even original. He then adds, what we don't know about this wall is how far gone those bricks were with lime mortar, which is true, but it doesn't really move the analysis forward. So there are far more immediate unknowns that are ignored if you're focusing on that, and that's, are the bricks original or replacements? Is the cement pointing recent or decades old? What strength is the mix? How deep does it go across the wall? So to reduce that to what he then says, it's an obvious question of what your bricks are like. That's only a partial representation, because obviously, yes, brick matters. It's not just about the brick in isolation. It's about brick and mortar working together as a system, as it always is. And what we can clearly see here is cement mortar overlapping, soft eroding brick, loss occurring through the masonry unit, which is entirely consistent with what Joe is describing. Roger then says, so you can't simply say that every time you're going to use sand and cement to repoint a wall built with lime, you're going to be doing it any great damage. And that's, for me, a massive problem, because in a conservation context with soft historic brick like what we're looking at here, that's exactly what you can say. It's not a slogan, it's a principle that is grounded in compatibility. So if you take a soft, porous, hand-fired brick and pair it with a hard, dense, cementitious mortar, you're creating a mismatch where moisture is going to be preferentially forced through the brick, stresses are not evenly shared, and the decay is going to be concentrated within the masonry unit itself. So that isn't conditional, that's inherent to that particular material pairing.
And again, Nigel Copsy talking about sandstone churches that he's worked at in the Midlands, and he said that there's nothing that can stop that sandstone from deteriorating. As the salt's coming out, it's just blowing the face off the sandstone. And again, the same sort of things happening here, but I would suggest that these bricks are a very soft rubber. They're not all the same, all the bricks through this wall, and you get this an awful lot. So you can clearly see that in some areas the wall has fared better than in other areas. And where this spalling has occurred, where these bricks have deteriorated, you can see that the mortar has been blown away or whatever has happened to it, but it's lost its adhesion. They should have used a lime mortar, but if they'd used an NHL lime mortar, they may have not made any difference to this particular wall.
So then he references Copsy again, saying, Nigel Copsy, talking about sandstone churches, says there's nothing you can do to stop that sandstone from deteriorating. But yeah, for me, that is just a misapplication in this context. Firstly, there's no reference given as to where Nigel Copsy said this. But secondly, even if Copsy did say that in a specific context, that doesn't translate to erosion is inevitable, so therefore material choice doesn't really matter. Sandstone weathering is not comparable to soft historic brick repointed in hard cement. So those are just completely different materials with different mechanisms and completely different problems. He then goes on to say that I would suggest these bricks are a very soft rubber. I don't know if it's like a Cockney thing or whatever, but to me, that wording was worth pausing on, because like rubber in that context isn't really meaningful. If what's meant by that is that it's soft, porous and friable, then cool, but those are terms that are actually usable. They matter because they relate directly to strength, permeability and compatibility with mortar. But using vague language like that might sound descriptive doesn't actually tell you anything precise about how the material behaves. And I find that when the description isn't precise, the conclusions that follow from that usually aren't either. He then continues, they're not all the same, the bricks through this wall. You can clearly see that the walls fared better in some areas than in other areas, which is true, but again, it's used to dilute the point rather than clarify it. Variation in performance doesn't disprove incompatibility. It usually confirms it, on the contrary. So he adds, finally, they should have used lime, but if you'd used an NHL, it may not have made any difference. And again, a complete oversimplification from an actual conservation, plastering, rendering point of view, because NHL isn't a single thing. If you had an NHL2 with a high free lime content, like a good brand, St. Austria or something like that, a nice high free lime content NHL2 with an appropriate aggregate and a correct ratio, then, it would behave completely differently to a dense cement mortar. That's unquestionable. So reducing that to it may not have made any difference is not a serious comparison that we can make. And then we get to what was, for me, probably the most concerning part.
I think what you've got to do with a wall like this is you've got to stop the water getting in, and the way you'll do that is by giving it a coat of storm dry, which will repel the water, so it means there's less moisture getting in, therefore there's less moisture to get out.
So I don't really know how to be any more kind about it other than to say that that is fundamentally wrong. This is a traditional wall built with lime, meaning it is designed to manage moisture, not to exclude it, right? Trying to stop water getting in entirely just completely ignores how the system works. It ignores permeability and it ignores evaporation. So to then suggest that, giving it a coat of storm dry is like a fix-all just completely ignores all of that. Now, what you're then proposing to do is apply a water repellent treatment over an already compromised wall with incompatible pointing. So what happens when moisture gets in? Because it will inevitably. So now you've reduced absorption at the surface, you've potentially interfered with drying behaviour, and you haven't addressed the root cause of the issue at all, which is incompatible mortar and poor moisture movement. So this is in no way a solution. It's an additional layer that is applied over the problem. And on a wall like the one Joe is standing in front of here, soft historic brick, that kind of treatment is just out of the question. It's entirely inappropriate in a conservation context. So again, there seems to be a pattern where the principle is acknowledged, it's diluted with some assumptions, and then replaced with an oversimplified solution.
Now, I think this fella is very interesting, Mike Haduck. He's saying something which, is fundamental to this whole argument when people are going, this is all due to the sand and cement mortar that you're using, and it's blown the face off the bricks. But let's have a look at this.
The water comes over the side, it gets into the brick, it all falls apart. This is all falling apart. So, can't really do much about it. You look down in here, it gets wet, the brick blisters. You can see down in here it all fell apart. The water gets in there, everything falls apart.
Right, so then he brings in Mike Haduck. I'm not familiar with this guy, but he's from America. I'm just going to blitz through this section quickly. I've made a few notes and things just for efficiency. So he's up on a roof. We're looking at some brickwork in very poor condition. Mike says the bricks are really bad. Roger says that they're really bad. And at that point, we're in complete agreement. There's severe damage. Mike then says that he didn't build any of that. Mike then says that water gets in the holes, freezes and busts everything apart, which shows us that there's a freeze-thaw cycle scenario, which is important because obviously that's not completely universal. It's quite specific. He then says that people tell him it's because there's Portland in it, and that he's seen a lot of jobs with Portland where there's nothing wrong with the brick. But that means that he's dismissing the mortar as a primary factor based on other examples he's seen, but he doesn't give us any detail as to what those bricks were like, what mortar strength was used in that particular setting, what kind of exposure was there in that location, what detailing was there. He then adds that nobody uses lime where he lives, and that he goes to hundreds of jobs where lime is a problem. But again, it's completely unspecific. We're not told what type of lime there is, what mix is used, what application it is, what condition these examples are in, none of that. He then shows us another wall, which is raked out, poorly maintained, and it looks like there's a rough, patchy lime-based coat, and he says that it was done with lime. He says they put this lime mortar in there and the bricks don't hold up, they fall apart because of the snow. But even here, the comparison just isn't holding, because what we're shown here with the bricks, they are nowhere near as severely damaged as the earlier ones that we were shown. Not even close. So again, we've got no context. Is it the same brick? Obviously different exposure, but was it done at the same time? What kind of mix? He then concludes, all this lime mortar, everything falls apart. Whether you've got lime or Portland, the lime falls out first and then destroys the brick. That statement I had to pause on, because if the lime's falling out, then how does it go on to destroy the brick? If anything, that's the opposite of how these systems are literally supposed to behave. So, as I've said before, a lime is designed to fail first. It's designed to erode first and be the sacrificial element and be replaced without damaging the masonry. So if the mortar's been lost, obviously you've got a maintenance issue. There's obviously high levels of exposure where you're going to get accelerated weathering, but the idea that the lime itself, particularly once it's no longer even there, is somehow causing the brick to be destroyed just doesn't hold up at all. So that's either a misstatement or a complete misunderstanding. I don't really know, but as it stands, it's not a technically coherent explanation. Roger then responds with,
so there you go, that goes right back to my point. Using a sand, cement and lime mortar is very often exactly the right thing to do.
Now again, I'm more than happy to engage in discussion surrounding any of these topics, but nothing in Mike's clip supports that conclusion whatsoever. Mike never mentioned sand, cement, lime mixes, proportioning, compatibility, or control comparisons between these systems. He was talking about cheap perforated brick, extreme moisture exposure, freeze-thaw damage. That does not in any way translate to cement lime mortars being the right thing to do. And more importantly, these materials and conditions that we're witnessing here aren't even comparable to what we'd typically encounter in the UK, especially when we're looking at historic masonry. So again, the pattern seems to be repeating itself, where we're bringing an example, stripping it of its context and drawing a conclusion that doesn't really get supported by what was brought. So yeah, it's just, this isn't evidence of cement lime mortars being the right thing to do. It's a completely misapplied example.
Now this is Stephen Bull, and he's working on the Union Chapel in London, lovely building, and he's doing a bit of repointing.
Right, so as Roger just said, we've got Stephen Bull here working at the Union Chapel, London. We can see him preparing a hot mixed lime mortar. He's got kibbled quicklime, some sharp sand, lime placed in the middle, covered over, and then water added to initiate the reaction. It's a well-controlled, traditional process. Now, This section is fairly thin in terms of substance again, really, I think, but there are still a few points that are worth addressing. So Roger first addresses the PPE. He points out that Simon's wearing gloves, goggles, a mask, and makes a comment that this is dangerous material, and that if you get it in your eye, you've got about 15 seconds before you go blind, which is fine. Yeah, quicklime is hazardous for sure, but so are a lot of materials and tools that are used in construction. Cement in the eye is no good either, especially if it's got hydrated lime in it. Cutting equipment is no good. Blow torches, angle grinders, saws, all of these things carry a risk. So, you know, the point is, risk managed properly is just part of the job. That's just how construction is. So he then says,
hey, oh look, now he's done up with all the kit, and you don't see that a lot.
and again, I just find myself questioning, you know, is that really true? I think most modern sites have eye protection, gloves, masks, ear defenders. You know, he's not in a hazmat suit. He's wearing basic, sensible PPE for the job. So this idea that hot lime is somehow uniquely dangerous isn't really grounded. Handled properly, it's a controlled material, not an exceptional hazard by any means.
Where'd you get metal buckets from these days? You seen any? I don't see them.
We would normally leave this for 24 hours and then come back to it tomorrow and sieve it through to take all the lumps out. And then we've got a material that we can store in plastic bags or in tubs until we need it when we add more water and make a mortar mix.
There you go. You see, now there's the first thing is like, okay, 24 hours, come back tomorrow and then store it. You know, the whole thing is extremely labour intensive, and quite honestly, a lot of sites wouldn't allow you to do that, wouldn't allow you to carry out that process of mixing hot lime unless you had barriers all the way round, warnings. Everybody had been trained in the art of mixing it. So for a lot of building, it's a totally impractical solution.
So again, for me, what this is doing is just completely missing the context. What Stephen is doing here is preparing a specific material for a specific conservation task. This isn't general building or a modern site workflow or something that is being proposed for volume house building. It's a controlled preparation method for repointing a historic structure to match original materials. And even with that, this is just one approach, because if you're using a powdered lime instead of kibbled lime, you probably wouldn't have had the same sieving process. If you're not hot mixing in the same way, you could use it immediately. And if required, it can be mixed off-site as well and then transported if you are going to wait to use it. So this idea that he's presenting of this is how all lime has to be used, or how all hot lime has to be used, and then rejecting it as impractical on that basis is just a complete misrepresentation. So yeah, there's not really many people that are suggesting that this is something to be used on every site by every operative for every project. What's being shown here is an appropriate method to a specific building in a specific conservation context, and it can't be judged as if it's being intended to replace modern standardized construction workflows, because it's not. They're not the same thing. So again, there's this pattern of taking this example, sort of removing the context and dismissing it based on criteria that it wasn't ever designed to meet.
Now, I'm just going to play a little bit of Michael James. He was a landscape gardener who started doing pointing, and he doesn't actually do any building as such. You can't watch a lot of this, and you'll see why in a minute when he starts.
Roger then brings in this lovely chap, Michael James. Now, personally, I quite like Michael. He's a bit eccentric, sure, but he's clearly engaged with the material and he's speaking from experience. So Roger introduced him by saying this stuff about he's only going to play us a little bit, and you'll see why. He's a landscaper who started doing pointing. He doesn't really do any building as such, and that's fine as context. But I just feel like it's kind of already setting the tone that things are due to be dismissed before we've even really heard what's being said here. Michael then tells us a story about a medieval king who supposedly punished masons for using lime putty that hadn't been matured long enough, something like 40 years. Now, clearly, that's not necessarily meant as a literal, testable, historical account. It's one of those passed down trade stories, right? But like a lot of these stories, it's probably exaggerated, simplified, or symbolic. It's certainly not coming from nowhere, though, because it reflects a real long-standing understanding within the craft that the maturation of lime putty affects how it behaves. Michael also mentions that he has putty that he's been maturing for several years, which is completely normal. I do as well. Roger responds to this by saying,
I mean, come on. a particular king of England that we can't remember the name of used to have masons' hands cut off if he found that they were using a lime putty that was less than 40 years old. A medieval king, he took the lime putty, took it down to his laboratory, tested it to find out whether it was 3 years old, 5 years old, 40 years old, and if it was less than 40 years old, chopped the guy's hands off. So this is the kind of nonsense that floats around between these people. I mean, they do get a bit carried away. All the evidence is that maturing of lime putty makes absolutely no difference.
And so for me, again, this is where the issue is. So dismissing that story as exaggerated is one thing, that's fair, but to jump from that to maturing lime putty makes absolutely no difference is a completely separate claim, and it's just not accurate. There's a well-established understanding both in practice and in study that matured lime putty becomes more workable and develops a finer particle structure. It improves plasticity and cohesion. So, you know, does it need to be 40 years old? Of course not. But to say it makes no difference at all is just completely incorrect. And then again, for me, it's just like you're exploring lime mortar and trying to explain lime mortar to people, and you're making claims like all of the evidence, and then you don't bring any of the evidence. Like, what studies are you citing here? What references are you giving us? There's no context to this at all.
So here's a lad, D. Porter Contracting, and I like this guy.
Okay, so then we brought this clip from D. Porter Contracting, and we can see him here. I'm assuming this is Mr. D. Porter. On-site overalls, stood by the bell mixer, and he's saying that he's going to show us how they mix lime. Now, straight away, we can see that he's using a bagged NHL 5 mortar. And he does say at the start, to be fair to him, that there are many ways of doing lime, and this is just his way, which is a completely fair disclaimer, so this is nothing on him at all. But the material choice here is obviously important, because an NHL 5, especially this brand, is a strong hydraulic lime, closer in behaviour to cement than to a high free lime system. And it's not typically what you'd associate with softer masonry or conservation work at all.
He's using an NHL lime there, which a lot of the guys are saying don't bother with using that because it's no better than using a sand cement.
So again, there's no nuance in the explanation here or the reasoning, because like I've said before, NHL isn't a single uniform material. There is a significant difference between an NHL 2, a 3.5 and a 5. And beyond that, mix ratios matter, aggregate choice matters, and again, free lime content varies between manufacturers, so that matters. So to then reduce all of that to it's no better than sand and cement without specifying a type, ratio, context behind that, it's just not analysis, it's generalization. And where he also says, like, a lot of guys, like, who are a lot of guys? What is their basis for saying that? Whether they're even working in comparable conditions at all. So, again, we're not dealing with evidence or explanation. It's just vague, unattributed opinion here. D. Porter then briefly talks about frost, working conditions, and timing of lime work.
So what he's pointing out there is a very good point, is that there's a very limited season with doing lime pointing. And although a couple of people disagree with that, there are lots of people who say, quite honestly, you can't really start doing any kind of work with lime out there till about May, and you're risking it if you carry on past October. So I don't know whether that's the case or not, but I know there's a lot of people who believe that and say there's a season for doing it. So if you're a bloke that does repointing with lime, then I don't know what you do in the winter. Maybe you go to Marbella or somewhere. If they need lime pointers out in Marbella, I wonder if they got this obsession with lime out there.
So again, it's much of the same, really. Instead of, you know, talking about looking at conditions, exposure, temperature, material behaviour, it becomes, some people say this, some people say that, but lime work isn't governed by opinion or consensus, it's governed by conditions primarily. So whether lime can be used depends on, like I say, temperature, moisture levels, frost risk, protection availability during curing times, not simply month of year. So reducing this down to like May to October as a general rule is just, again, it's just super oversimplification. You know, he then adds, you know, maybe you go to Marbella. I wonder if they've got this obsession with lime over there. And it's like, I know it's clearly meant as a throwaway comment, but even that I just find slightly telling, because lime isn't like some niche localized preference. Historically, it was a default building material across most of Europe and beyond. So, you know, from the UK all across to the Mediterranean to large parts of the Middle East, lime mortars and plasters have been used because they were available, they work, and they're compatible with the materials that are used during building. So it's not an obsession, it's a continuation of what historically worked. And again, more importantly, he even acknowledges, I don't really know whether that's the case or not, is what he says. So again, it just highlights the issue. We're not being given a clear position or a reasoned explanation. It's just a collection of things people say.
So this is interesting. Another American. Let's just see this bit. This is crazy what he's saying here.
There is some fooling around going on with the lime putty. And what that is that many of the lime putty suppliers are just selling you hydrated lime. They'll say it came from quicklime, and it did, because it happened at the factory, but they pressurized steam through it, and it ends up being just a soaked hydrated putty.
This is crazy what's being said here. Yeah, so what's being said there isn't actually that crazy at all, I don't think, personally. The video is explaining a distinction that's pretty well understood. The difference between a true lime putty slaked from quicklime and a hydrated lime that's been turned back into putty. So the video goes on to explain that quicklime slaked into putty forms a colloidal structure, whereas hydrated lime, once dried and then re-wet, behaves more like a simple particle suspension. And the practical implication of that is that a true lime putty is much better with terms of plasticity, cohesion, performance. A rehydrated hydrate is a much weaker structure, more prone to shrinkage and cracking, and that's the point being made, essentially. You can obviously debate how significant the difference is, how it would perform in different contexts, but the distinction being made itself is not what I would consider to be crazy. So Roger's response to this then is,
if you're not more confused now than when this video started, then you're probably a very rare beast, because I certainly am.
the confusion isn't coming from the material. I don't think it's just coming from how the material is being chosen to be interpreted, because what's being shown here is reasonably simple, really. It's just an example that not all lime putty, quote unquote, is the same. How it is produced ultimately affects how it's going to behave in the end, and that's it. There's no contradiction there. Instead of clarifying that, though, Roger moves straight to saying,
masonry cement that you buy is a mixture of lime and cement. Quite honestly, if you use that in your brickwork and your bricks are a reasonable quality and you've got some kind of weather protection there, then you're probably doing just about as well as you possibly can.
And this is where everything sort of collapses back into the same issue again for me, because we've gone from understanding materials and distinguishing between them straight to defaulting back to a general purpose product. Now, masonry cement is by no means a neutral solution. It's pre-formulated, it's standardized, it's not designed with any historic compatibility in mind at all. So to present that as about as well as you can possibly do just completely ignores everything that's been discussed. He then adds directly after this, if you've got soft red rubbers, then definitely use a lime mortar, but the question is which one? But again, that question has been answered that question has been answered multiple times throughout the video. It depends on the masonry, the exposure, the required performance, not confusion but judgment. He then returns back to hot lime and says hot lime seems to be the way a lot of them are going, but it's a nightmare to handle on site, which again just repeats the same point that we've already addressed, in that hot lime is not something that's universally required or intended for every solution, and it's not inherently impractical. It's simply one method used where appropriate, and that's fine. So to present it as difficult, dangerous, impractical just completely misses the point. And then there's this suggestion that using masonry cement with some kind of weather protection is about the best you can do, but again, it's not a material solution. That's just working around the material rather than understanding it. And so ultimately, yeah, it's not that lime is inherently confusing. It's just that it's being explained and responded to without the necessary precision that it requires. Yeah, so if you enjoyed the video, drop a comment, like, share, subscribe, always appreciated. And yeah, thank you.